Good morning. This is Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs. And we have Doug Farnham, Deputy Secretary of the Agency Administration. We appreciate you coming in on short notice to talk about a new index that we're hearing more about that has a proposal that would impact budget adjustments. So thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Madam Chair.
Just close. It's good.
You like me to jump right into it?
I think so. Unless, I mean, I don't know if you met Senator Harrison and
Wendy Harrison, Wyndham County. Nice to meet you.
Are you looking for
I live in Bradford.
yes.
And
if it helps with context, we're going to listen and weigh in with Senate appropriations on this particular, the use of this index for this particular $3 million is what it sounds like. And as you may know, it's being discussed in the building for other things. So we really need to get a handle on it. We may need to have it back in. But,
absolutely.
yeah.
So for the record, Douglas Farnham, Deputy Secretary for the Agency of Administration. For context, I've worked for the state for about 11 years, most of it at the tax department for the last year and a half. I moved over to AOA and I've been focused on the administrative oversight of the multiple use pandemic funds, so the Coronavirus Relief Fund and then State Fiscal Recovery Fund. So with State Fiscal Recovery Fund, the Treasury is the federal agency on that fund, and they have a final rule construct that gives the states discretion to use the money, the 1.05 billion, as the states see fit, but within certain parameters.
So what's that called again, Doug? That piece of it, state?
The State Fiscal Recovery Fund.
Yeah.
So that is the primary federal fund, a very large amount of money that this index was created. It was aligned with some of Vermont's priorities and tried to mesh with the Treasury priorities that the federal government put out in the final rule. I do know that the index is being talked about quite a bit and various elements are being picked apart and pulled apart, as can be done with any index. So it's not intended to be, no index is perfect. No index properly and absolutely captures the situation in every town. It's intended to give us a spectrum and kind of a litmus test for towns. That being said, the administration is open to adjusting certain elements or refining methodology as long as the overall purpose of the index isn't completely.
Can you just begin big picture?
Yeah.
Like, what are you indexing?
Yes.
Let's tell the story of what the index is and how it came to
So the Treasury asked states to prioritize underserved communities. And they define this as communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life. So they have a pretty high level interpretation. They leave it up for the states as to how to define that. It can be done geographically in this instance, because so many of Vermont's programs, the governor and the legislature worked towards a large amount of investment in infrastructure style projects that interface with towns. We chose geographic borders for the purposes of this. The other use, of course, you could prioritize. In some instances, we have prioritized BIPOC communities for certain programs, and that's a different, a identity-based community, not a geographic-based community. So that is the definition, the high-level definition that we started from. And again, this is a should. So this Treasury is saying, with these monies, you should do this. So when we do it, it does help us with the federal auditors. It does help us demonstrate compliance with their programs. But I would be overselling it if I would say the Treasury is saying, you have to do this. If you don't do this, we will take the money back. So in our guidance about how to apply the index to programs, we say integrate this in your programs where it makes sense with the particular program. This cannot override any aspect of state legislation or state rules, right? If the federal government said you have to do this, then it could have overridden Vermont legislation, but that is not the case, and that is not the guidance we're issuing. So it's intended to be an additional lens or filter. So say you have a water program and two applications come in very close, one municipality scores low on the index and one scores higher. It's intended to be a little bit of weight, not exclusively determinative.
So here's
Is it okay to do questions?
Yeah.
As we
Yeah.
go? So, if this does get adopted and goes through, would it be better if it were a rule? No,
I-
What it would be.
So I think in order to create a rule,
yeah, or statute, I mean,
But
you're
would it
saying
be
it's not,
session law?
would it
It
be
would be session,
official?
because it's temporary, because it's not an ongoing thing, I would
Yeah.
assume it would be session law.
It may become an ongoing thing. In that case, would it be?
Not because the money's not there.
if the legislature desired it to override other
Hmm.
priority criteria, like in water programs, generally, the Agency of Natural Resources does an excellent job focusing on the environmental impact of projects. They don't necessarily focus as much on how much that water project is going to help that particular community. It's a benefit they're aware of, but it's not their priority. Their priority is natural resources. So
And we just passed the EJ thresholds last
Right.
year, which are in statute, which speak to 3 population segments that we see as underserved communities. High population of people of color, moderate population of limited English proficiency, or less than 80% of median household income. I don't know, I mean, I know that now the federal government doesn't want to use race for a majority of their calculations because they're worried about litigation. But I
It's
don't know
always
how much
concerned.
you looked at what exists and went to see, should any of the, we have opportunity zones that we've created. We have so many indices, so how much did that go into the thinking?
So we looked at the social vulnerability index, we looked at the environmental justice index, we looked at the rural capacity index that's produced by third-party organizations. So we looked to see if there was an index that made sense for Vermont. I would say that the environmental justice index, the map looks very, very different from this. So I'd say it's a very different index, and it actually tends to measure a lot of things that happen more in more densely populated areas. So it
Urban.
can, right.
Blight and issues. I mean, this is this really squarely falls in rural communities, right?
But as we know, there is a lot of blight in our rural communities.
Yeah, right. I
Right.
mean, that's what I'm curious about is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like rural communities are immune to that.
And
No,
they're not physically pristine either. There's a
Mhm.
lot
Yeah.
of dumps. and
Yeah, there's a
waste
weight disinvestment.
there too. So, but I didn't mean to get us off track. But we can
So-
decide that later.
So those are the indexes you use to establish these geographic borders. You use rural capacity,
Well-
social vulnerability, and environmental
We
justice.
evaluated those indices, pulled some of the criteria from those indices, and like, for instance, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the college or university indicator. And that's one that's present in most indices take account the presence of a college or university because it's such a strong indicator for prosperity in that particular community and nearby region. But we had to fine tune it. It was a light switch initially, and we fine tuned it by student population. So for most of the state, the impact of that in that particular variable is actually quite low. So sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit.
Well, we're encouraging.
Yeah.
it. So I'm just curious on that university index aspect. How far around a town is that net cast? So for example, Lyndonville, we have a fabulous college in Lyndonville. I wouldn't say the Northeast Kingdom is in
Right.
such great shape.
Three-quarter.
So I'd love to know what that net impact around a town is for this index.
So initially, we had no impact, right? That didn't make any sense. It was just the town that it was sitting in. So like UVM only impacted Burlington score.
Yeah.
Then we looked at other indexes and a lot of them said 25 miles as the commuter distance. So we had that and then we thought about Vermont's roads and winters and systems.
Yeah.
We reduced that to 15 miles. So there was a bit of trying to find a reasonable amount. There's no one distance that really, because it also scales by the size of the institution. Middlebury has a smaller impact radius than UVM. We were trying to balance getting it accurate and right with complexity. So in a lot of places, when you fine tune and fine tune and fine tune, you can no longer explain your results to people.
Right.
So we went with 15 miles. That could be reduced to 10, as in 2 towns over essentially. But that particular index, it's not driving the overall rankings that strongly, because over 200 towns have an 88 or higher out of 100. So it really is measuring the impact of 3 or 4 larger institutions primarily. We scaled it by student population. We felt that was a fair way to do it. Like Plainfield gets, you know, a lower score because of the presence of Goddard College.
Right.
Smaller college, so they don't get a 0, they get like a 48 out of 100, which growing up in Marshfield and Plainfield seems relatively accurate. Goddard actually does stimulate local business, and local discussion.
It's continually shrinking.
That is, Senator, a fair point in that, you know, we measured demographics over time for workforce and for income. So we did some overtime trends there on the need side, but we did just take 1 year of enrollment for the college factor. So we didn't measure a trend line with that particular college.
So, yeah, it's interesting, 'cause I would think hospitals would also have the same impact on the community.
That's actually a really good point. It might be something we could put in there.
Because
instead.
they require similar degrees of education to do those jobs, that people live within similar kind of commuting distances. I think hospitals might.
It's an excellent point, Senator. As I said, we're interested in
Yeah.
incorporating the factors. I think the idea is, I'm sorry, Senator.
No, I was just gonna get in. One difference, yeah, hospitals and universities are typically the highest employers of areas. But I think the student population is different than the hospital service, you know, the folks at the hospital service.
Solely
Oh,
staff.
staff, definitely. So, yeah, it can get pretty complicated.
But also people who choose to live,
Are
in
you,
a hospital, right? I mean, that.
are you able to put on the screen all of the factors?
So I did share the documents with staff. I think you can put, put it up behind me.
It'd be good to look at while we can jump
Yeah.
around, but at least then it's up there.
Yeah, and I think we should get an overview
Yeah,
of how
what are we doing with the
Sure.
index?
So there are two purposes of the index right now. One is for prioritization within ARPA state fiscal recovery programs, where it's appropriate and applicable, right? Some programs, the index wouldn't be applied to. We're leaving that up to the program managers to decide.
Is
how
it
much
within
they
a $3 million bucket or is it outside of that? That's
And-
just for budgeted.
And the second use is for a proposal in the BAA for $3 million of general fund to provide technical assistance in the nature of 5 activities that are kind of on the planning to development spectrum, from a needs assessment where a town they know they want to grow in a certain way, but they don't know what they need to do in order to accomplish that. So a baseline needs assessment all the way up to multiple years of grant and project management, so that a community can carry a project forward.
So we're aiming at the towns that have 3 select board members who may or may not have any education or a higher education. They may or may not have a part-time town manager. And they are definitely disadvantaged in planning, zoning, writing grants.
Right. That's what this is aimed at.
Yes.
Yes,
This
And
is
we
aimed.
put some money to give money to the Housing and Conservation Board. We did something.
yes, the legislature took action in several areas related to this.
Okay.
So VLCT was given a grant to provide high-level assistance to the towns. So it was
Which
about,
they've done.
I think it was 800,000. I personally think they've done an excellent job with that. I've worked
Katie, this
closely
is
with
Katie
them.
Buckley's work.
And that has been for 2 full-time positions, like for the length of ARPA, so for like 5 years. So that money was granted early by the legislature in the first year and intended to last throughout the ARPA implementation phase. So I think they've done a great job of corralling the towns and
Yeah.
getting them information. But
Well,
that's
that's what
high
they've
level.
done that's what they've done. They've
Yes.
given them information. Now towns need to do the work of figuring out what they want to do.
Right.
And this is designed, all this is designed to help us focus and prioritize what towns would be appropriate to get that additional help.
Right, because the premise being some towns don't have the people, and actually in most towns, it wouldn't make sense for a small town of 500 people to have a full-time planner, right? It would be a waste of resources unless they really had aggressive growth goals, right? But in most places, that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in smart and gradual change. And so part of the idea is if we can stand this up, it might be a way to help access just shared resources so that, you know, you have someone working in 5 or 6 different towns in an area. And that's supporting the activity, not.
So how much money is considered state fiscal recovery funds?
So the 1.05 billion is state fiscal recovery,
Okay,
and that's been pretty much fully appropriated by the
I
legislature.
was gonna say most of that's gone.
About 600 to 700,000 of it is in this area of infrastructure style projects. And you start to winnow it down, right?
how much money? Sorry, I missed.
600 to 700.
Between 600 to 700 million, so
Okay.
about
Oh, billion.
2/3 billion, sorry, yeah. About 2/3 of the money was put towards these long-term capital programs.
600 to
Millions, because
700.
we have only 1.05 billion.
Yes, 600 to 700 million.
And you, okay, so you want our blessing to use this index? You want it written in session law? You plan to use it below other existing indices? And it was designed almost exclusively to help rural communities? Like,
So for the application of the index to the existing programs,
yeah,
we feel like that's within just administering under the federal rule. So we're trying to be transparent that
Right.
we're enacting this, but we don't feel like additional statutory change is necessary for us to use it.
okay.
We're not planning on, okay, we feel so strongly that we need to override this water program's criteria with this index. That's not what we're proposing. So for the $3 million technical assistance program,
Mhm.
we're using it as an eligibility tool. And I think because it's driving eligibility, that's why it's become a little bit more controversial,
Mhm.
because there's a list and towns either are on the list or they're not on the list. And that's always tough.
But you, when you designed it, you looked back and said, okay, we have what we want because it only helps rural communities that have low administrative capacity.
I think
And they're gonna rise to the top of the use of all of this money.
it definitely was designed to help
Make
towns
them
that we
more
didn't feel would have more, wouldn't have the capacity, whether or not they were rural. I do think it does help a majority of smaller communities.
Do you have a map?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think,
Is that in here? But, you know, we have to, I mean, bigger towns already have so much of this capacity.
so
And
it's in the
some-
user guide. I don't know if that's.
Some do.
I mean, like, we're talking about a lot of money that would be.
We're not, $3 million is not a lot of money.
No, but we're talking about $600 to $700 million, if I understand that, would start to use this guidance and its infrastructure dollar distribution.
That's what they can access. That's what Katie Buckley has been going around to
Right.
all the towns, no matter what size, to share with them what is available federally. That's the VLCT piece, which is the education piece of what's available. That's the 600 to 700 million you're talking
Right.
about.
Yes, so apologies. 600 to 700 million is your starting point that municipalities can technically
Mhm.
participate in
Access.
some way or another. 19 of our programs, so a smaller number of those programs translates, that's around what the 600 million is about. It's about 19 programs. When VLCT looked at what programs would be more appropriate for use of the index or for smaller towns, it's really 4 or 5 programs.
Okay,
So the index is really only applicable to a smaller number of programs, and like village water and wastewater.
Mhm.
That's a $10 million appropriation that was made last year by the legislature. That one is I think highly appropriate for prioritization, because in the Vermont statute, it says small residential water systems.
okay.
So I think we have a
I
justification.
just wanted to be
for
really clear,
approaching it
like
that
what the
way.
universe is.
Yes.
Because algorithms can have huge impacts and cut entire communities.
So,
So-
sorry, you got the maps behind you. So to
You
go
wanna
back
go
to
to the
Nisha's
first?
point.
The first 2 maps above, these,
Yes, this is the this is the map that would primarily, so the towns that are, yeah, the one on the right is towns that are in the top 25% on the current index.
Of the way you applied this index, these are the towns that came up saying, sort of screaming, technical assistance, please.
Right, that they had the highest need, and when you combined their need score with their capacity or lack of capacity score, they came out at the highest level.
The RPC, you know, because they have, each of these regions is within an RPC and RDC district. So they do have those additional capacities. You took that into account also.
Not necessarily, because, so there was an additional appropriation to RPCs of ARPA funds. But it was for general levels of technical assistance. I would say the RPCs are doing an amazing job. They're doing everything they can.
Yeah.
But they have a generalized mandate, and nowhere in their grants or instructions are they directed to prioritize smaller communities.
Right.
They do their best to help smaller communities, but these types of projects are generally what I would call higher touch projects. They require a lot more support to get moving. They require a lot more ground level assistance. So I think the RPCs are doing everything they can, but when we put money, and I think the administration didn't propose it either, right? We thought adding to the capacity RPCs would help meet the need. No one proposed targeted assistance to help smaller communities participate.
So no, this is really helpful in understanding how these communities have been identified. And so it's 3 million, which is actually, in the scheme of things, not much. If you're talking about like a 5-year task force of some variety going to work with these towns. As you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I do want to give us 5 minutes to talk about the indicators. So that,
Oh, sorry. Why don't you finish your proposal and then we can chat. I apologize.
okay. I mean, the indicators, I think where the details are that we probably want to make sure we feel comfortable with it.
And then we have a lot of ideas. Doug, I know it won't surprise you.
So the best place for the indicators, Scott, is if you're back on the spreadsheet, the README tab has the indicators laid out. On the
Okay,
table.
here it is, and it's on page 3 here.
Oh, yeah, and I think they do have. So first we have the capacity score, and the capacity and the needs sub-indexes are equally weighted. So even though capacity has fewer variables, it receives an equal score to the overall needs score. The first indicator was the presence of a town manager or administrator. Now, again, there may be gray areas around the edge here where if someone has a part-time administrator and it showed up as them having a town administrator, they get the same impact. So we weren't able to fine tune the data to, you know, if they have someone for 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week. The college or university presence, which I talked about earlier, again, that's impacting, because we rated it, we scaled it by student population. Most of the state is receiving a minimal impact, and it's really trying to measure the impact of 3 or 4 larger institutions. The population density, this was done with tiers. So 100 for towns with fewer than 2,500, 2,500 to 10,000 receive a 50. So if a community between 2,500 and 10,000 has a really high need score, they could still move up on the index pretty well. And then because we are trying to target communities with less capacity, above 10,000 received a 0 for this. And then the change in population over the last 20 years, what we're trying to get there is how has the community been growing? Have they been shrinking? If you have a growing community, odds are you've been investing resources, and but if your community is shrinking, you're probably finding it harder to meet the day-to-day tasks, keep your community going. When people are coming out of the picture, it creates a much different dynamic. So that population change was trying to get at how likely are they to have volunteers? How likely are they to have, you know, active participation in the community? Anecdotally, it does link to the population growth and change in a community. So that's where we picked these variables, hoping they would be good proxies. But of course, they're So
Yeah, they're good so far.
need index, any questions on the capacity side? And again, I definitely want to look into maybe integrating the hospital impact and maybe instead of the college impact
Or in
Um,
addition, I think it's,
or in addition.
yeah. So are those the 4 indicators? That's it?
That's
Does
the
anyone
four.
object to that, or, I mean, I think it definitely should be looked at. I think often they're near each other, but there's probably.
We might not
Well,
ding them for both in the same, I don't.
Right,
know.
Yeah,
exactly.
Mount
Maybe-
Scotney Hospital.
Yeah,
Maybe college
Is
or
not
hospital.
close to.
I think it should be a or, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is different. I mean, I think it is definitely a factor. But it is different than a college. But it is, especially in terms of, workforce and, but a place like Beta or a huge employer like IBM could be similar
It's
to a
really a
hospital.
major employer.
That
Like
would
a
be good
watershed
too.
employer.
Right, but
Yeah.
like one major employer.
So like in
Yeah.
the Upper Valley, we have not only Dartmouth and the law school, but we also have DHMC. And we
Right,
have
right.
Mount Scotney Hospital. So we have Gifford.
So you're not getting any money.
No, and we didn't, Windsor County does not show up there.
It does not happen.
Almost
There, I mean,
not.
at the same time, there's probably different research to show what a university does versus a large employer. So we just want to make sure we're not,
Right.
it's not apples to apples.
And given all the richness of what's available in the Upper Valley, I would say that the town, I represent many towns that are under 1,000 people. And I would say that Reading, which does not have a town administrator, Reading could do and would benefit from a task force team of technical assistants to guide and work with them with a project that they identified over time. So even within that, all that richness of opportunity that's in the Upper Valley, I think there are some towns even within that would.
Right, so let's look at the needs.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
do we only
Yes.
have until
Yes.
9?
Yes.
Orange County
Yeah. Let's
Oh,
make sure we get-
so-
No, it's not your fault.
Race and ethnicity.
needs all the help
um,
they get.
So what are these things, Doug?
So moving into the need index, this is intended to try to get a somewhat balanced picture of the health of that community. And again, it's never going to be perfect. Race and ethnicity, Vermont ranges between somewhere around, well, actually it goes down to 1 or 2%, but most towns are around 8% BIPOC community, and Winooski, is I think 28 or 29% BIPOC community. So the higher your BIPOC percentage, the higher the assumed need. The reasoning behind that, and we did look at other indicators, English as a second language. We couldn't find a data set that we could
It's
incorporate.
very small.
It's very difficult. So we went with the census data here. The assumption being Vermont has actually seen a lot of growth in our minority
Yeah.
populations or BIPOC populations, over the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah.
When you have a newer community, they have less support system, they have less of a history within that community. It generally, it could lead to higher levels of need. So that was one reason for including that.
Sorry, is the needs section scored differently?
It's
there's-
still on the scale of 100.
Okay,
But
but it goes up instead of 50%, right? It's a gradient.
yes, the data on the need side was much more granular. So the data on the need side is graduated much more precisely.
So you
It's
race,
not 100 or 0.
Right.
so what else other than race and ethnicity? did
High
you-
school graduate, percentage of population of individuals over 25 years that have a high school diploma. Most indices use college graduates. We felt like that was perhaps a little patronizing, like people in the trades are also extremely valuable members of the
And
economy
Lots
and
of
earning
good
more in some cases. So high school graduate over 25, households with broadband. This one is tricky, right? This is just measuring access to broadband, not the quality of that broadband.
That would be a challenge.
We
that
won't
would-
go there.
Yes, that's an extreme challenge that Vermont's trying to work through. But we did still feel, even with the problems, that just having some level of broadband is still going to
An
help.
indicator of what, yeah,
Of capacity, yeah,
Right.
it's totally an indicator.
yeah.
The grand list change over the last 10 years from 2011 to 2021. My personal background gives me a little bit of bias in thinking that property trends are an indicator of
Yes.
a community's affluence.
Yeah.
Like if your properties are appreciating because people want to move there. It shows up, and it's really a good proxy indicator. It shouldn't drive everything, but it's one of 8. So a lot of towns in Vermont, their grand lists have been declining over the last year. So people in their primary source of wealth, their home, is losing value.
Yeah.
And then so housing cost burden, I think this is a very common conversation right now.
We're
Housing
just
cost
wrapping
burden
up
is a
this
real problem.
topic. No, it's fine.
Per capita income change, really measuring if people are growing their income over the last 10 years.
Sorry,
Percentage-
income change over 20 years?
Yes, over the last 10 years. Basically seeing if their wages, if their income as a community has been going up. Percentage of individuals above 150% of federal poverty level, the ratio of your affluent to less affluent members of the community is generally going to determine how well a community can take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And then labor force participation rate, of course, this is a problem all over the state. But again, we're trying to measure the relative level of the problem. And it goes through 2020. So of course, the massive disruption in labor force participation from the pandemic isn't fully captured here, but we wanted to get at the historical trends. And going into this whole massive pandemic recovery effort, how ready was a community based on these indicators to engage in the system and to apply for grants? And so that's the hope, is we're just trying to measure how ready someone was to come in the door, work with ANR, work with VTrans. We should be lowering barriers wherever we can, but that's difficult, and they're not always our barriers to lower. Federal programs, we have no control over the requirements, so we can only try to help them work with the program. We can't make it easier, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that's the concept, Madam Chair. I
Yeah.
apologize for sprinting. through the
No,
last
you
part.
should not apologize. We had lots of questions. This was a really good introduction. You know, we have a little while for BAA to get over here and to have this discussion. I think we'll want to have you back. I will just say, and these conversations can happen informally as well as back in committee. I'd love to see the difference between looking at just need and then adding the capacity side, because the capacity side is a little bit more segmented. You get a 50 versus 100, your 2,500 or your 10,000. And the capacity side appears like it would cut out a lot of a particular kind of community that otherwise has need. That's what I'm going to articulate as my concern right now, is you seem to get 2 very different answers if you look at need versus adding in capacity, but that's my hypothesis and I'd love to test that.
I think the 2 indexes do function very differently, yes.
And I'd love to, either in committee or out of committee, chat with you about what the composition of the task force, you know, the resources we're going to levy on these communities once we identify them, so that we don't reinvent the wheel and that we use what we have, maybe give them more capacity, but
Absolutely.
but not reinvent the wheel here.
Senator Harrison, you would.
Yes.
Just, this is your work, right? This is, yeah, I'm really glad you showed your work, because I wanted to be able to follow through the
Yeah,
math.
because this
And-
doesn't have that, the printout doesn't have.
Yeah, but this is great, and because this whole effort is for fairness, basically, I really appreciate that you're providing the background data.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So we'll try to work on having you back this month. And in the meantime, if you're able to start to send answers to some of these questions along, or bring them in on paper, whatever you feel comfortable with, but you know, that's somehow if we can start to get an informal response and then have you back in.
Yeah.
And Madam Chair, one thing is, we would be certainly open to working with the Joint Fiscal Office to fine tune some elements, or especially in the capacity side.
Yeah.
We did our best, but there's a lack of data, and it is
Yes.
a little bit chunky. So we would welcome it, but obviously they would need legislative sponsorship to
Yes.
work with us.
Well,
Okay.
Who the money goes to is also, I mean, that's, I think, the piece at the moment I'm also interested
Right.
with
Right.
that group.
Thanks so much.
This is very exciting.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you.
And Jill Remick was at the CTE thing that Wendy and I went up to, the listening tour on the how to improve CTE funding and stuff.
Oh, excellent.
She's, yeah, it's great. She's thinking property value and Doug.
So, Peter,
Good
I
morning.
think you're our star witness. I don't know, and Stephen, actually, you're on the list too. I don't know if you two want to go separately or come up together.
Yeah, I think Steve's got the kind of our initial discussion.
Okay,
on the
great.
version, and then
Yeah.
If I can just, maybe add on.
I would, yeah, I mean, that was one angle of things that, we're looking at in this bill that we're starting to talk about, but if, we'd love to hear in the next 40 plus minutes, other priorities you have or other trends you're seeing
Steve?
in the housing market.
Yeah, I mean, if you're comfortable,
Yeah,
I think
no,
maybe
you
you
go
join
for
me
it.
and
Yeah.
we chat together.
Sure. And just identify yourselves for the record.
Yeah, good morning. For the record, my name is Steve Foster and I am the president-elect for the Vermont Association of Realtors.
Right, and Peter Tucker, Director Advocacy and Public Policy. Good morning. Nice to see everybody here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I gotta say, this is my first testimony before a committee, so I'm
Oh.
excited.
It's going to be very nice.
Do
you want us
Full
to-
disclosure, I am a retired realtor.
Oh, that's right.
Former member of this org.
So at least you haven't learned a lot of
fantastic.
bad habits. So that's a good sign. At least you haven't learned a lot of bad habits in testifying. It's encouraging.
Well, thank you so much for having
Please use
us.
my guidance, so who knows?
It's good to have a buddy up with you too. So.
So as I understand it, one of the questions on the table is, should there be consideration to convert commercial office space into residential housing? Fortunately, the National Association of Realtors has created a case study for this exact topic. I believe Mr. Junkrat shared it with the group. There is a precedent for this. And it is feasible to do. Obviously there are challenges that are associated with that. First and foremost, having entire buildings vacant in order to do this, or portions of them are harder to find. Across the state, I ran a report just last night to try and quantify, how many fully vacant properties there were. And I couldn't find many at all. I mean,
Yeah.
I know there's one here on State Street. I know there's a few up in Burlington, but really the number is quite low. And then, I often question how
That's just in Montpelier. Or you think
Montpelier, Burlington, I looked in
Okay.
Bucklands, there are certain buildings that are vacant that used to be used for office space. However, what we see are typically buildings that have office space available that are not totally vacant. And that poses a challenge when it comes to conversion. And then also, when we think about converting commercial into residential, we talk about the impact that it might have on the vibrancy of the community. When you take out those commercial spaces, you reduce opportunities for individuals to operate businesses. For a long time, I sat on the planning council of Morristown, a community that has built a lot of housing, whether that be good or bad by public opinion, we've done it. And one of the things that our zoning regulations were keen to keep in place is that first floor commercial space. We felt that it was critical to the vibrancy of our community to maintain spaces and opportunities for businesses to have a space to operate and to grow into. So any conversion that would happen, I would encourage any developer and the committee to consider keeping those first floor commercial spaces, whether it be retail or office, because it's critical to income. We all know the cost of construction has risen, so we go to the affordability aspect of how it incentivizes developers and building owners to make these types of conversions. And I just pulled some rates for Chittenden County because that has the best data. And so when you think about commercial rents in B or C class office space, an older building, maybe it doesn't have a lot of amenities for
What kind of office space?
B or C class.
Okay, maybe in.
What is that?
Meaning, an older building, not a lot of
Okay.
amenities, maybe there's probably no cafeteria, there's probably no lobby or common space, it's just straight office space. We see annual rents in the $12 to $15 range, and that's annualized. So what it equates to is about $1,000 to $1,250 a month per 1,000 square feet. I took 1,000 square foot number because that's about the size of a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, depending on how you break it up. And what I'm going to do is give you a comparison between office space.
Do you have this testimony written?
I do,
that you
and I can
send to
share it.
Scott?
I can, absolutely.
Okay, great.
What I like to do is just give you an evaluation of what the average going rates are for office space versus the average going rates for residences, and how that relates to affordability for a potential renter. So in a B to C class space per 1,000 square feet, we see between $1,000 and $1,250 a month in rent. In a nicer building, newer, some amenities, you could expect monthly rent per 1,000 square foot between $1,300 and $1,800. If you're thinking of converting those spaces, a 1-bedroom may yield you between $1,200 and $1,500 a month, and a 2-bedroom between $1,700 and $2,000. So when you look at the delta between what somebody would earn as office space versus what somebody would get as a residential rental, it's really not that large.
Yeah.
So you have to weigh the incentive as to why somebody would want to take their office space and convert it. Often it's an economic incentive, and based on the information that we have in the market, that economic incentive there isn't a large gap. So there have to be additional incentive put in place in order to convince property owners and developers to want to make that conversion.
So vacancy would be an incentive.
100%.
I mean, so that's, I hope, a piece of what you're going to get to is the commercial market post-COVID.
Sure.
And give us a picture of that.
And
because I-
turnover, just
Yeah.
the volatility of.
Yeah, exactly, because turnover costs money. But I think, because it sounds like you're right, for a thriving commercial building, there isn't much difference. But that doesn't factor in vacancy and the picture post-COVID. So I think that's what we're also hoping to hear.
Yeah, so nationally, so the vacancy rate in the state of Vermont is harder to quantify than a national average.
The commercial vacancy.
Correct.
Is what?
Is harder to quantify. We can take national trends and extrapolate it to our communities. Or we can go canvass the streets and figure out which buildings are vacant. I have not done the canvassing part. The way that our commercial brokerage system works is not everybody's required to report to our multiple listing service as realtors. We have a shared database. Some commercial licensees choose not to participate in that database. And as such, the information becomes fragmented.
Yeah, that's too bad. That is.
It's a product of the industry. So nationally, we see office space, the need for office space being down 115 million square feet in 2021 as compared to 2020.
Is there a percentage that goes?
Yeah, what does translate?
Yeah. So Peter's going to look up the percentage as I continue to chat.
But it's down considerably.
It's down.
I think that's what we.
Right.
And it's not a secret. We all know that people aren't returning to offices, they're working from home, and employers are becoming more flexible. I mean, my wife works at the Global Foundry buildings for M&T Bank, and her office is, they have, 12,000 square feet, which is a pretty large office, is all but vacant. Now, that would be a type of property that may make a nice conversion. Whereas you see these downtown buildings, you would hope that they wouldn't be fully converted so that there is an additional opportunity. I know Peter's gonna look up that rating. I hope to be able to give it to you.
Yeah, because that would be helpful.
Anecdotally, I feel it's much less in the state of Vermont than it is in other major markets. And
What's much less?
the vacancy rate,
Okay.
the total vacancy rate for office buildings.
Okay.
When we talk about conversions, you assume the building is completely empty or mostly empty. I'm not seeing that from a commercial practitioner standpoint. We're seeing office space available. Of course, there are cases where a building is empty, but they tend to be older, smaller buildings, which would make sense for conversion. But again, at what cost and expense? It costs a lot to do any type of construction. I mean, it's up to at least 17%. So when you think about your rate of return versus your cost of conversion, again, you become very disincentivized by current rental rates. On top of the fact that, oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, finish your sentence. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, and I don't know.
On top of the fact that that tenant landlord law is very different than law related to commercial leasing. So that I feel that tenant landlord law sometimes is an additional disincentive to long-term rentals, because it is quite difficult to gain your property back when you have a problem tenant. So
Is that not true in commercial?
no, I mean, it's much easier.
It's easier to evict
Correct.
businesses than it is individuals?
Yes, ma'am.
If they break the lease.
If they break the lease or they're nuisances, yes.
My antique shop just got evicted.
So,
Landlord wants to renovate,
Oh.
so he's gonna renovate, put in insulation, and then we can come back, but the increase in rent is more than you're saying the average rental space is.
And where is this space?
In downtown Montpelier.
Yeah.
But
oh, this is the
downtown,
business on Main Street?
yeah, downtowns, elevators, access is, that was a major cost in the buildings over the Aubuchon store.
Mhm.
And that's inhibited any kind of, really updating or doing
Exactly.
that. Because the stairs are about as steep as ladders. They're not easy for anyone unless you're into, doing aerobics to navigate. But putting an elevator in is prohibitively expensive.
And someone's recommended we add like an elevator revolving loan fund to the bill.
Yes.
Yeah, huge issue.
I would certainly heard with help with accessibility.
Right, Senator Harrison. and that's it.
Thanks. There is actually a similar, some program I know, because it was a building owner in Bellas Falls that got some state funding. I think it was historic funding,
Okay.
because you can't have residential. It's not just difficult,
Right.
it's not,
You
it's a
can't.
code if you don't have an elevator.
Mhm.
So just a couple of questions. Are there financing barriers to having commercial and residential in the same building? I've seen that in other places where banks won't finance it, is one question. And then, what about vacant retail? Have you looked at that? There are like Home Depots that are empty, and that seems like an easier
Sure.
lift.
I'm not aware of a Home Depot that's empty in the state, and I would,
In Brattleboro,
okay, well, that's
but
great.
they're still paying the rent.
Oh, so they're there, they're just not utilizing that space.
Correct.
Okay, well, that's a great one to put down.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, no,
jump in
please.
For a little bit, and that is that, one of the analysis that NAR did, looked, somewhat at older buildings, and the shape of the building actually really matters. If you think about a Home Depot, that's what got me on this, is a big square box.
Yeah.
I mean, the exterior units are, you could probably see how you get light and egress and that sort of thing, but you've got all this core space that's not as useful for residential. You know, so older buildings, you know, more unique buildings, actually what they said was a wedge-shaped building or a kind of a streetscape building, much more adaptable. The other part about an older building, and, you know, this is getting to incentives a little bit, is that it probably needs renovation, right? I mean, in other words, you know, versus a brand new office building that would be like, oh, man, we're gonna change all this space to something else. An older building is probably needs to get that done at some point anyhow, so it would be, you know, the owner would be, if with the proper incentives, the owner would say, hey, this is, you know, this is worth
I need to
it.
do this anyway.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to do it sooner or later, right, and make that move. You know, the challenge, and I don't have the gross numbers, you know, we just know that office is down significantly, but to your point, you know, one of the things NAR is doing is advocating for a bill that would extend historic tax credits to, you know, this conversion process.
Okay.
You know, because as Steve said, you know, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of costs are going up. So there needs to be some additional
So
incentive.
if we added to the downtown tax credits for that purpose, maybe that would be. something.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, I'd have to look at it specifically, but I think that's the, you know, we're trying to do it, NAR's trying to do it on the national level, which, you know, we know is gonna take some time. But, you know, I do see it if it can match here with, you know, kind of accepting that as historic. And the other part that the NAR is advocating for, because this was purely an office, the HR bill is purely an office conversion, is to add shopping centers, hotels, and there's one other that I'll get. So I think that, you know, we would like to see those additional opportunities, mostly because as, you know, as Steve started looking for properties, there's not that many. But there may be, you know, some other kinds of properties, especially, you know, hotels and retail space that could be,
What about college campuses?
I'm sorry.
What about college
It would
campuses?
be
like-
fantastic.
Well,
You know, that-
VTC has, you know, the dormitory space.
Right, right.
Both at Green Mountain College and at, I mean, which is now privately owned again, but
Mhm.
VTC I know is looking creatively at what to do with their dorm
So
space.
isn't
Vermont Arts.
Vermont College.
Right.
Yeah, and so's Vermont, yeah.
And those campuses have a lot of amenities that people look for that would make really high quality housing.
Mhm.
You know, they have green spaces, they have, you know, accessibility.
They have
offerings.
parking.
So this
Parking.
could be a nudge in that direction.
Yeah,
for somebody
Exactly, yeah, we
looking.
need that a
Actually,
little bit.
Co-housing, it'd be perfect for co-housing too.
And to your, you know, to answer your question, typically when you have multiple income streams in a property, you have more options from a lending standpoint, because your income is diversified. There are plenty of local banks that are willing to lend on commercial properties that have tranches of money that are actively looking for deals.
Great, great.
But our downtowns have tons of commercial and residential buildings.
I understand. I've just seen that. When it's in the same building, I've seen that in other places. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to
Or
make
the
sure that
interest
that
rates are a
wasn't
little
a
higher.
barrier.
Yeah, I can imagine the
Okay.
discussion with the bank officer and he's
Yeah.
saying, I don't know about this.
Right, right. It
But I think
didn't
Steve's
fit a
point-
category.
Yeah,
And there's less funding available. That might be an incentive for housing. That's, you know,
right.
affordable housing credits.
But to go to Ann's point, one of the issues we faced in Woodstock, and it's true in every one of our historic downtowns, is our historic brick blocks
Mhm.
that now have vacant space on the second and third floor because they can't, and the cost of converting them and putting in elevators and making them accessible so that they can take advantage of the income stream of apartments and/or commercial space on the second, third, and fourth floors is prohibitively expensive. So I think if we can get at that,
Mhm.
I think that would be great because it goes to our disability. I mean, if we could make our downtowns and village centers fully accessible, it would be such a boon for development. I mean, it
Just
just,
call it the elevator though. Yeah.
I think a lot of people would like to see that.
we would very,
You
yeah, all of
could
us
put an
would.
elevator and then you'd have to have like a covered glassed in
Yeah,
walk along the
Right.
back.
And-
Kind of
I think
methodic.
it's the nice way to do it.
and many are blocks. So many, and some are
Mhm.
same level, some aren't, the buildings, but all of them, I think. I mean, they're just, I don't think, if we could create a model for that and make it work would be just.
And in particular, in those old buildings,
You're writing that
you
down.
know, not only do you have accessibility, but you have fire, safety. and building
Yes,
code,
yeah.
in upgrades. Yeah, that, I mean, are quite costly. And that's why we see the tax credits as a big incentive in our designated downtown. It's why, you know, like LHP and Downstreet choose to build in downtowns because they use that tax credit incentive to attract money to help their cause.
Have you seen any examples of the kind of thing that we're talking about, in which older buildings downtown have been renovated, elevators have been put in, and you've had that conversion between commercial at a lower level and residential at an upper level? Yes, to get an idea, A, has it been done? How has it been done? Does it work? And what does it cost?
LHP did it in Morristown with the Arthur's Block building.
That's right. And the Wilson Block.
Yeah, and it worked out really well. It's fully rented. Their cost per unit, I will say, is much higher than an independent or a private developer. I think LHP averages.
What's LHP?
Memorial Housing Partnership.
That's right.
I think LHP averages a cost per unit around $350,000, whereas a private developer can go in and develop an apartment for around 150 to 180,000. Right? It's staggering, the difference between the two. And that's mostly because of the regulation process that LHP has to go through in order to you know, permit the project and get through, you know, the hurdles they have.
Well, that was the next question that I had, is if there's such a major difference, what are the elements of the difference? And could Lamoille Housing and the other housing developers actually do something that's more along the lines of what a commercial builder does? Because a commercial builder has to abide by land use regulations, Act 250, and everything else.
Mhm.
And it's always been a question as to why the three-letter organizations always have costs that are so much astronomically higher than private developers to do the same thing.
A question I have been trying to answer for the last 6 months, because we have a co-housing project that we're trying to develop with an organization in Montpelier. And Downstreet's process is extremely costly and extremely long. So it creates a large disincentive. I would say that the best person to have this conversation with would be Jim Levinsky, the head of Memorial Housing Partnership. But I can tell you that
Jim, what's his last name?
Levinsky. I can tell you that LHP has begun to work with private developers to erect the building and deliver them finished, at which point they will then purchase the building at a cost much lower than what it would cost them to develop. So that's some of what we've seen as a workaround.
I see that happening allegedly at St. Albans too, where they're trying to do effectively the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess what the obvious question after that, and Brandy, is, well, why don't we see more private developers doing it? I mean, if it's so much less, why are private
answer.
developers not
Yeah,
doing
it's
it?
not
I
a
can tell you,
rhetorical
I can tell you why.
Still waiting.
You know, I mean, simply, you know, the cost of permitting and the risk is really the big thing. And, you know, I
The risk of what?
risk of
We
being
know
appealed,
everybody needs space to
Right.
live.
but
so-
being appealed.
In which process?
In Act 250.
Oh,
Okay.
we know
And
appeals
so,
are not-
yeah, sorry, but that's why I wanted to jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're doing downtown, are you running into Act 250 or are you running into local planning and zoning?
Depends on the community. Local planning and zoning, typically, residential is the least of these use. You know, whereas commercial being second and then industrial being the most, they're restricted wise. There are certainly communities where zoning prohibits residential in districts, but it's more related to Act 250. And to elaborate on Peter's statement, when you evaluate risk from a development side, you think about probability and time. And the longer the process goes on, the more time and the less probability you have in completing your project. So when you increase uncertainty in time, you decrease incentive to build.
And removing that barrier in towns that have good zoning and bylaw regulations is something, you know, we've talked about this for years. But, you know, quite honestly, you know, that's what's got to happen. And, you know, we understand. I mean, you can't fund all of these building projects. Government simply can't do that. It needs private, industry to be able to get in there and to be able to build and make a
There's
profit.
also an affordability issue associated with it, because when agencies do this through government, as you have mentioned, it's like this is twice as expensive and much longer in time.
Right. Look at the French Block here in Montpelier. I mean, they had to put an elevator in. They drove huge beams down through the little Wobbechaans,
Yeah.
That was my experience when I was trying to find screws and I'm walking around the supports. But they did it, but at an incredibly high cost. And
That
I
doesn't
think
cancel out for.
only the nonprofits can really do that, right? Like a for-profit developer can't do that. The partnership that's going on in Morrisville is interesting because they're a for-profit developer is kind of saying, I can build this and turn it over to you guys and you can run it. And we can do it quite a bit more cost effectively, I think.
But the cost of permitting is the same no matter who's doing it.
That's true.
I mean, so that's an unfair.
But you take it out. And that's the real, as I see it, is not that it takes you longer, costs you more money or whatever.
Yeah. And it
It's that
feels,
a developer says,
Is it
I'm
worth
taking
my
that
time?
risk. I'm
Right,
not-
and well, and the lesson for us is no matter what that is, it doubles the cost of the project and we're trying to house a bill that
Right,
lowers the
I'll go do
cost of
something
the
else,
project, yeah.
And that's the thing we don't know. How many missed opportunities have there been? Because developers said, I just can't take that on. I'm gonna get appealed. It's gonna just get dragged out. And, that's
Also
where.
dealing with the appeals process. I mean, the average appeal is over a year right now on an Act 250 appeal.
Yeah.
And the lack of certainty is something that I hear from developers, that even if I do everything that I'm supposed to do with all the engineering and legal for Act 250, I still don't know going in whether or not, having covered all these bases, I will get approved or not because of the subjective nature of the criteria.
right. And yet our data from the NRB is that there aren't that many appeals, that that the timeline is shorter than everybody says, and that a lot of them
Timeline
have
of
drive.
those that are approved is short, relatively
Yeah.
speaking. But what isn't figured in the timeline is the amount of time and cost with legal and engineering that has to be done before the application is filed in the first place, and the duplicative nature of the process, both municipal and Act 250. Those are costs.
Duplication is some cost and
We'll
time.
have that conversation.
And we've had that conversation in here anytime.
Yes.
To answer your question about the downtowns, we don't just, a lot of our focus for new space or housing opportunity isn't necessarily centered around the downtown, but along municipal service corridors. So any place that has, either municipal sewer or water or a public water source are areas of focus where, we as the realtor party try to advocate for, additional housing opportunities.
Are there, you have 15 minutes left, so we could stay on this topic and ask questions. Are there other topics that you want, we'll have you back when our housing bill is complete, but if there's anything you want to preview for us, that's a concern.
Like we haven't even hit residential yet. Fully residential.
Or just how you all are doing.
Any questions? I know Peter wants to get to our objectives and I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Why don't we
if
do
you don't
that?
mind,
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
and just wanted, so I see two incentives in commercial conversions that potentially
Mm-hmm.
could help. First one is that tax credit. If that gets extended to buildings that are being converted for residential use, I think that would be a good incentive. It could very likely be the difference between doing a project and not doing a project. The second one is in actually H400 from a couple of years ago. There was pretty good language about allowing the Natural Resources Board to extinguish a Act 250 permit on an existing property if the change of use, this is a change of use thing, right? Because most of those commercial properties already have Act 250 on them for that commercial use, not for residential use. So that was some language that I pulled out of that old bill, and I can certainly provide that to you that I thought would be another additional potential benefit
I
there.
think that's come up, I just don't have the language.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting to be in economic and housing, talking about natural resources, but, the reality is, natural resources hasn't really wanted to take, hasn't been able to come to terms with how we kind of make this work and, get the administration on board, that sort of thing. So we are really appreciative that you guys are willing to kind of put it into the housing bill. When we look at housing, everybody talks about a housing crisis and, we understand that. I would also say that for folks that have owned their own homes over the past 2 years, their wealth has increased dramatically. When you look at their own personal wealth, that is the benefit of home ownership. And that's really where we come in, right? Exiting homelessness, subsidized rental housing, we do a little bit of business there, but for the most part, we're selling homes. And, we really believe that, maybe not single family homes, but that home ownership offers families so many benefits that we really need to get that going.
Yeah.
So, Steve sits on our government affairs committee. We have a group from the state, and very thoughtful folks. I mean, I'm not showing up here with my own stuff. I'm showing up with what these guys told me to say. And, really, when you start talking about housing, immediately go to permitting. And, I think the Representative Bongart's bill is I'd call it a zoning and bylaw bill purely. At this point, they had the 10.55 rule in there from Act 250, but he pulled it out. That's something I want to get to.
It's in our, maybe he pulled it out after the version that we put into our bill, I think. So I'll check on that.
So at any rate, that's the municipal side. I think we're going to see some action there. My own personal input on that bill, I've looked at version 10.1, I know 11.1 is out, is that it's a lot of sticks and not many carrots. If you're looking at it from a municipal point of view, it's like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And, some incentives in there would be nice.
Carrots. Always need more carrots.
Yeah, that'd be nice. So what we did was then we go, okay, you get it permitted, where can we build this? And it's going to be, we understand that compact development, smart growth is super important, and that's where building can be accepted. But it needs services, right? Municipal services. So you start looking at wastewater systems, and I actually did get a breakdown of it. And I was thinking, well, it's going to be all Chittenden County, but actually it's pretty well distributed around the state, the 72 municipal wastewater plants that are in operation. So I feel like it's diverse enough to be the right balance. But I also feel like little towns that don't have wastewater systems, a lot of that is where that infill development could occur, in Hardwick, 2 houses here and a triplex there. And so we need to be attentive also, not only to, certified municipal wastewater, but also allowing for some kinds of incentives in those other towns. And that's where eliminating the Act 250 rule that requires if you build more than 10 units within 5 miles within 5 years, we believe would allow those small builders in their own communities. They're not going to have to drive to Burlington to build a property. They can build it in their own communities, would be incredibly beneficial. And then one last point, Peter Vina, who is the chair of our government affairs committee, sits on the planning commission in Jay. And he said, water and sewer kind of presents an issue for us because we have a wastewater system, but we don't have a water system. People service on their own wells. So I think that potentially looking at wastewater systems as the requirement and maybe being at least flexible on the water side could potentially help some of those little smaller communities that don't have both ends of it.
Before we get to questions, I just want to say you're welcome to aggregate these and stay in touch with us to look at ways to incorporate it. And we're taking all comers and we'll start to have loose threads if we.
The start of the process.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, we tried to address this in our mini chip proposals because this is exactly what towns need, water and wastewater.
Yeah, the Westford example.
Yeah, Westford was one, but there are many more communities now that proposal has been out that have put their hand up and said, we would love to do a small thing so that we can make our smaller towns more sustainable, build more housing in those village centers.
Agreed. And we know that's the right place, I mean, it's obvious that that's acceptable to society, right? I mean, so we want to encourage that and find ways to accomplish it. So that's,
Not just accessible, it's smart.
it's smart.
Yeah.
It's smart. I mean, we can't do sprawl. If we're gonna invest in our downtowns and village centers, we need to protect the rings around
Mhm.
and protect
Yeah.
the undeveloped property, because it's more expensive to develop undeveloped stuff in the backcountry than it is to do it downtown.
Right. So that's kind of, how we're thinking, we're
Right.
trying to take an approach of like, okay, where's, what do we need? Housing. What's the issue? Typically, we've said permitting. And then, what are the additional things that will allow a builder to, to hook up to municipal wastewater, and really have that piece of it, kind of a fixed, what the number is going in. So, once again, certainty in terms of, what your costs are going to be. Just, one quick point, on short-term rentals, because very often the housing issue is like, well, we're on opposite sides. We're either a short-term rental or we're workforce housing. And these guys are stealing from those guys.
And we have them in later today, the
Yeah.
short-term rental.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Julie? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Excellent. I actually heard Maura Collins the other day in testimony say, look, short-term rentals are really like less than 3% of the housing, supply in the state of Vermont. And they really are focused up and down the spine of the Green Mountains. Many of those are second homes that somebody's using and would never ever make available for residential housing. So I think, I'm going to get off of that, but I do think that focus is not correctly aligned, with what we really need to do. We need more houses.
We have to build our way out.
Yep. That's probably the best statement that could be made. We got to build our way out of this.
Well, we have put $350 million into that challenge
Yeah.
over the last 2 years. So it's not like we haven't invested masses, and now the queue to getting it built is.
Right. Yeah, and they
Slowing us
accomplished
down.
it. I mean, I was at the
appreciate
housing
that.
thing last
So,
night.
I think we have put the money we are able to put and then some
Yeah.
into the building piece.
Right.
The building piece, as we now know, is gonna take us a little longer than we'd hoped.
Yeah, but now you need to spur private development.
Right.
And the way you do that is by, reducing their costs and increasing their certainty.
So how do we reduce the supply costs?
Right.
That is,
That
at the
is
moment, one of the biggest barriers, workforce and supply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not permitting, not all that other stuff. It's what I hear from developers
Sure.
in our part of the world is,
And I would say that those costs, have to come back into alignment with the economy, maybe tariffs at the national level, things like that, they could reduce slightly cost of materials. But for the most part, we got to take on what we can take on, and that is typically permitting and, and then infrastructure, making sure that properties are ready to be developed.
yeah.
While we have you in these chairs, and feel free to add anything else, but we started to look at some data in various committees that showed us that this is what appears to be the largest delta in housing prices in Vermont history, just a huge jump,
Mhm.
50%. In some parts of the state, 60% in the Burlington metro area, huge jump
Yes.
in the price
In a
of housing.
2-year
Yeah.
pandemic period.
I know that, doesn't
Mhm.
hurt you all in your field necessarily, but is there anything you can tell us as is the market evolving? Are prices going to plateau? Are you seeing less people from out of state? Is there anything you could share with us? Even if it's
Sure.
You want to do that one?
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes, there has been a steep increase in home value, partly because the cost of the replacement cost of those homes has gone up dramatically. If it costs you, let's say, $500 a square foot to build new, and that may be on the low end of the building, you can reasonably get a resale at $350 or $400 a square foot. Whereas a few years ago, that number was, 200, let's say,
Yeah.
just for argument's sake. Typically, and the national statistic and where the Fed likes to find its sweet spot, so to speak, is about 4% increase a year in value. That obviously has been trumped in the last 2 years dramatically. What we will see and have seen in our marketplace is less homes coming to the market, so less inventory. As interest rates rise, less would-be investment purchasers, because money is more expensive. I think what I know from my own personal practice, that home buyers for primary residences are still in the market. They're willing to pay the extra interest because they want a place to live. So interest rates from a primary residence standpoint are individuals looking for primary residence are less susceptible to interest rate adjustments. The resale market is hindered by spaces for individuals to go to. So larger homes, where families who may have empty nesters or, no more kids, don't have a place to downsize. And that's what we feel is a big hindrance to churn in the market. If you think about what a couple who had 3 or 4 kids, maybe they had a 4-bedroom house, where do they go once those kids leave? Well, they're competing for that ranch style 2-bedroom home that first-time home buyer is now trying to purchase. So what we get is essentially a deadlock, because that first-time home buyer is competing for the same house as the downsizing couple, and that person, leaving their first home can't upgrade to a larger house as their family grows. So we've hit kind of a point in the market where we're stagnant. We don't have movement like we used to. Please.
So I represent lots of communities that are desperate for more downsizing housing.
Desperate.
And they're slightly different because the downsizing crowd also doesn't want a lot of land. They want less to take care of. They want less.
Mm-hmm.
Less is more.
Yeah.
And so, there is a huge need in our community.
Tremendous.
Because if we're, to liberate those homes for families that are growing rather than contracting.
I think a great analogy when you think about housing churn is individuals purchasing vehicles. The individual looking to buy the new car is going to go out and purchase a new car and then sell their used car to the dealership, which then, somebody coming up is saying, okay, I'm going to go purchase this used car. So we're not seeing that same turn. The new housing is typically going to be on the higher end, at least in our market right now, rather than the low end. And that will in turn free up housing for individuals to move up. That's what we see. And to your point, local zoning varies across communities with regard to lot size.
We're clear on that. It's one of the things we're doing.
And that is a tremendous challenge when you're trying to develop single family homes.
Yep.
And I just want to bring one more point while I have your attention, and I appreciate your time. Back to Peter's 10-5-5. When we think about the 10-5-5 rule, in practicality, what happens? Act 250, the 10-5-5.
Oh, right.
In practicality, what happens is that local developer that's developing the community, if they don't want to trigger Act 250 review, they have to go to another community, 5 miles away. And you take these individuals out of their centers of power, where they have resources, where they have local knowledge, which then again decreases the incentive to continue to develop. So
yeah. We are in final questions. We just have a minute or two left. I have a pet issue that I'm exploring, which is just what we're also seeing is people waiving all of their inspection rights. And I know you're on both sides of that in a transaction, but I'm starting to worry that it's, then the have-nots might buy their first home and are inheriting a disaster. There's no workforce to help them fix the problem right away, and they have safety issues.
Yeah.
Have you seen other states try to tackle this? Is there anything you think
Sure.
we can do about that?
Massachusetts requires septic inspections.
Okay. So some kind of pass-fail, standard.
This is referred to essentially an as-is purchase.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, people
Yeah.
are waiving all their rights.
Yeah.
Just to get
I think
Just-
that's coming back to earth too.
Okay.
I really do. I think that was a temporary market phenomenon.
Yeah,
that the
It's a
pandemic.
very
did
scary
come.
phenomenon.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we would always recommend inspections, and,
Yeah.
but if you want to get the property,
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
that's.
Yeah, it's our best
Danger
practice
will
to try and help protect the consumer.
Mhm.
Because who's the first person they call when
Right.
the basement leaks or,
Right.
the tub overflows? It's the person who helped them purchase the home.
Yeah.
So,
It
we
protects everybody.
we advocate, not to forego those types of assurances, but.
But they want the house.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, but so there are states that have sort of base minimum
Minimum,
things
Yeah.
that
Like
are in
as we
place.
come back down to earth, we might want to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, I
again.
mean, Massachusetts, as an example, has a wastewater, it's just
Okay.
something you have to do as part of the
Yeah.
transaction, and we all know that can be extremely costly.
Mhm.
Aside from the roof, the septic,
Yeah.
But this is a requirement solely for an inspection, not a requirement for fixing whatever the problem is.
Correct. Yeah.
But it has to be passed
So
in
the
order to
buyer's
sell the
aware.
house.
So that's a question, is whether it's a buyer's awareness or whether it's a mandate to have a minimum septic system before a house can be
Right.
sold. Those are two very different things.
yeah,
Right, so what is-
I think it's an awareness
Yeah.
Mhm.
provision.
Massachusetts.
So everybody is eyes wide open going in, here's the current status and functionality, and then like anything, we have negotiation. And you may be aware of a problem, and as the seller may be required to fix it, or may elect to negotiate with the purchaser to have them fix it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Or negotiate a lower price because in anticipation of having.
Yeah,
Correct.
at least eyes open when you go,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, or take a few years to fix it if necessary, but, because the regulator would likely know at some point if it's not working.
Well, and the mortgage lender.
Right.
That's the biggest
Subsidize.
driver.
Yeah.
The worst place to be is where in lower income, the seller has no money and the buyer has no money
Yeah.
and something needs to be fixed. And the lender won't lend unless it gets fixed.
Correct.
But they don't want you to default on your mortgage because you need to fix your septic system.
Right.
This has been wonderful. Yeah. I don't know if you have a last point right
Yeah,
now, a
I'm
little
sorry,
break.
I just,
Yeah.
in terms of like market statistics and that sort of thing, because I am a numbers nut.
Yeah.
And, what I can tell you is that, we think that the market peaked sometime in the middle of 22.
Okay.
As far as average prices and median prices, they've continued to escalate year over year. I expected to see that start to really tip off, and it hasn't yet. Good for the value of your home, but bad if you're trying to buy, because prices are still up. The real reason that, and I had somebody question me, why do we use average prices? Well, it's easy to calculate, right? But at the same time, really the part of the market that we're missing is that starter home.
Yeah.
That,
Yes.
so what happens? More expensive stuff sells.
A single
pulls the
question.
average up.
Starter or ender home.
Yeah, starter.
Starter and ender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that single story, 3-bedroom or 2-bedroom ranch with a garage.
Yeah.
Right.
1,000 to 1,200 square feet,
Yeah.
on an acre.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Or
No.
co-housing.
They don't need an acre. Well, downsizing
I
doesn't
think the
want any.
downsizing folks generally want it to be with other people.
Agreed.
More than the first
Agreed.
home people.
And that's where you look at
Yeah.
zoning and say, what are the
Right.
minimum lot sizes
Right.
and what are the requirements with PUDs?
Right,
You're
or
gonna move.
right, or condos.
You wanna move.
Sure.